What if the most powerful weapon in history was never a gun, a tank, or a bomb, but a conscience? Under the roar of engines and the smoke of battle, another war was being fought. A quiet war between the human soul and the machinery it had created. In the winter of 1944, freight trains rolled through the night, carrying thousands toward their deaths. The same steel that built the rails built the bombs, and somewhere between those sparks and shadows, humanity held its breath. Dictators dreamed of miracle weapons, machines that would crush the free world beneath cold precision. But across the ocean, ordinary citizens, farmers, welders, mothers, were turning wrenches and tightening bolts, building something entirely different. Not weapons of tyranny, but tools of liberation. Freedom has a sound. It hums in the rhythm of a factory floor at midnight, in the clang of a hammer, in the whistle of a worker who refuses to surrender hope. The Third Reich believed that terror and technology were enough to rule the earth. They were wrong, because the true miracle of World War II was not found in secret laboratories or rocket designs. It was found in people who still believed in decency, an engineer in exile who smuggled blueprints to save lives, a mother in Detroit, her hands stained with oil, building wings for bombers she would never see fly, a pilot whispering a prayer before dawn, knowing that courage was the only fuel left. This story is not about weapons. It is about what happens when the heart of a nation decides that science must serve compassion, not conquest. The factories of evil built destruction. The factories of freedom built deliverance. And somewhere between them, the future of humanity was forged in fire and faith. Stay with us, because this is not just the past, it is the mirror that asks us who we are and who we will choose to be when the next storm arrives. History remembers battlefields, the gunfire, the smoke, the victory parades. But the real battlefield of World War II was made of brick and steel. It stretched from the frozen gates of Auschwitz to the glowing furnaces of Detroit. On one side stood a system that turned murder into mathematics, death into routine. On the other, a free people learning to turn their sweat into survival, their unity into strength. When Soviet soldiers entered Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they walked into the silence of engineered death. Concrete chambers sealed tight, empty cans of cyanide gas, ashes stacked higher than memory itself. Here, the miracle of science had been bent to its darkest form. It was not just cruelty, it was calculation. Killing had become an industry, a process, a schedule. Those who survived spoke later of the deception. Fake showers, wooden benches, numbers painted above each hook. Victims told to hang their clothes neatly, as if order could make death less final. And then, a hiss, a silence, a machine that required no hatred to function, only obedience. That was one path technology took in the war. But there was another. Across the ocean, in a place called Willow Run, Michigan, another machine was at work. Not a chamber of death, but a line of life. Every hour, one brand new B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line. Every hour, thousands of hands moved as one. Farm boys who had never seen the ocean. Black women who had never been given equal pay. Mothers who had never been told that their strength could save the world. They built more than planes. They built belief. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, once warned Berlin that America's factories were more dangerous than its armies. He was right. For every weapon the Reich designed in secret, the United States answered with 1,000 built in daylight, born from unity, not tyranny. The contrast was staggering. The Nazis created laboratories underground, hidden from the sun, filled with slave laborers chained to the machinery of their own destruction. Meanwhile, American factories were lit with hope and powered by freedom's rhythm. There were no guards, no orders screamed through loudspeakers, only the sound of work and faith that work mattered. Technology, by itself, is never moral. A tool is only as righteous as the hand that wields it. The same precision that built gas valves in Auschwitz built engines for B-24 bombers in Michigan. The same chemistry that produced Zyklon gas produced life-saving medicine for Allied soldiers. The difference was not knowledge, it was conscience. The line that divided darkness from light was made of choices. Each rivet, each formula, each command carried a moral weight heavier than steel. Back in Europe, the Nazi dream of domination was being undone by its own arrogance. Factories buried deep in mountains, scientists working by candlelight, designs that came too late to save their empire. The war they imagined as a triumph of science became a monument to moral blindness. And yet, the technology they left behind, the V-2 rockets, the jet planes, the stealth wings, would later shape the modern world. It is the paradox of progress. Humanity's worst intentions can still leave behind tools for humanity's future. The question is always the same. Who will control them next? In 1943, as Allied bombers crossed the skies of Germany, one German engineer whispered to a colleague, "They told us this would make us gods. Now I only feel like a ghost." He was right. In every age, the race for power runs faster than the race for wisdom. But there is another kind of power, quieter, steadier. It is found in ordinary people who do extraordinary work without ever calling it heroism. A teacher collecting scrap metal with her students. A nurse writing telegrams to families she will never meet. A welder who cannot read the newspapers but still believes in freedom enough to fight for it with a wrench. They were the invisible army, behind every soldier on the front, the hidden heartbeat of democracy. They did not build weapons of fear, they built the wings of deliverance. That is where the true strength of a nation lies, not in its arsenals, but in its citizens. And as the world burned, a silent question spread across the continents. Can decency defeat brutality? Can unity defeat hatred? Can the hands that build also heal? Those questions were answered not in speeches but in sweat, in the rhythm of production lines, in the letters home from factories and farms, in the shared conviction that the war for freedom was not only to win a battlefield, but to win the right to call ourselves human. That was the unseen front line of World War II. And it is where this story truly begins. By the winter of 1943, the world's fate was balanced on a knife's edge. The Axis powers stretched across continents. Cities were burning. Empires were trembling. But deep within the chaos, something was shifting. A quiet, relentless turning of the tide. The battlefield was no longer only the trenches or the seas. It was in the skies, the laboratories, and the will of free nations refusing to kneel. Every morning, before dawn, the air crews at British bases watched fog rise over the runways. They knew that some planes leaving that mist would never return. They climbed into their cockpits anyway. Among them was Captain Henry Albright, a bomber navigator from Kansas. He kept a photograph of his wife and newborn son folded inside his flight jacket. Every mission, he would whisper the same prayer, "Let me see them again, let the light win." Above him, the roaring engines of B-17 and B-24 bombers filled the sky like an iron storm, their destination, German industrial heartlands, their purpose, not revenge, but resolve. And on the ground, hidden beneath Germany's forests and mountains, scientists worked in desperation. They designed rockets meant to cross oceans, jet engines that could outrun sound, and missiles that needed no pilot. Each invention promised salvation for a dying empire, But time was against them. The factories were breaking. The workers were starving. The belief was fading. In one of those underground tunnels, a German engineer named Karl Ritter stared at the schematics of a V2 rocket. He knew it could reach London, maybe even farther. But he also knew what it cost, the lives of prisoners chained to the machines that built it. He turned away and whispered, "This is not victory. This is madness." At that same moment, across the Atlantic, a woman named Rose Willow Monroe, the real Rosie the Riveter, was tightening bolts at Willow Run. Her hands were blistered, her uniform stained with oil. She worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a paycheck barely enough to live on. But she smiled when she said, "Every rivet we drive brings someone home alive." 2 worlds. One consumed by control, the other driven by conscience. When the Allies launched their campaign known as Big Week in February 1944, the sky over Germany became a forge of thunder. For 6 days, the air shook with the sound of thousands of bombers and fighters. Target after target, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, supply depots, fell under the relentless weight of industrial willpower. It was not only metal against metal, it was belief against fear. Captain Albright's bomber was hit over Leipzig. Flames crawled across the wing. He refused to bail out until every man on his crew had jumped. He landed in a frozen field, broken but alive. Later, when asked why he stayed, he said quietly, "You don't quit on your brothers. That's the difference between us and them." For the German command, the shock was unbearable. They had built a fortress of arrogance and surrounded it with science. Now they faced an enemy that built an army out of compassion and teamwork. Admiral Canaris had warned them years before. The Americans fight with machines, but they win with morals. He would later be executed by his own regime for speaking the truth. Meanwhile, in Detroit and Pittsburgh, the miracle of production reached a crescendo. Factories that once made cars were now churning out tanks, planes, and ammunition in numbers the world had never seen. In less than 4 years, the United States produced over 300,000 aircraft, more than all Axis powers combined. Each one a statement. Freedom can build faster than tyranny can destroy. But it was not just about numbers. It was about who those numbers represented. African American workers who demanded double victory, one over fascism abroad and one over racism at home. Women who proved that skill had no gender. Immigrants who welded their loyalty into the nation that gave them a chance. Together, they formed a mosaic of endurance and dignity. In Berlin, Hitler raged at maps and models, demanding miracle weapons. His generals knew the truth. The miracle was already gone. Because miracles cannot exist in a world built on cruelty. Still, the war dragged on. Every day, the Allied forces advanced, one ruined town at a time. Every day, more letters arrived at kitchen tables across America. "We regret to inform you." And yet, production did not slow. Faith did not falter. In April 1944, an American pilot described flying over Germany at sunrise. He said the clouds below looked like a sea of broken marble, glowing from the fires beneath. He paused and added, "It's beautiful, and it's hell." That was the truth of the war, the paradox of destruction used to end destruction. Every victory carried a shadow. Every advance carried a cost. But something larger was taking shape. The tide was turning. Not through superior weapons, but through superior will. Each day that an assembly line kept running, each hour a worker refused to give up, each life saved in a field hospital, these were the true victories. The momentum became unstoppable. By mid-1944, the Allies controlled the skies. By the summer, the beaches of Normandy thundered with liberation. And by the fall, the people of occupied Europe began to believe again. The world was witnessing a lesson written in both blood and light. Science without conscience destroys. Science, guided by humanity, redeems. That is why the history of World War II cannot be measured only in weapons or battles. It must be measured in moral endurance, the ability of free men and women to hold on to compassion while standing face to face with barbarism. If you believe peace requires courage more than noise, say Amen in your heart. Because every generation must learn this again. The fight for freedom is never just against enemies abroad. It is against the temptation within, to surrender what makes us human. And that is where the real turning point of the war truly began. When the guns finally fell silent in May of 1945, the sound of peace was almost unbearable. For 6 long years, the world had lived inside thunder. Now, there was only wind, blowing across cities that no longer had names, across graves that no longer had markers. Berlin was a skeleton of stone, Warsaw, a wasteland, Tokyo, a horizon of ash. But amid the ruins, people began to breathe again. The soldiers came home first, thin, quiet, carrying duffel bags and invisible wounds. Then came the letters, the medals, the photographs of faces that would never return. And slowly, the factories that had once built death began to build life again. In the American Midwest, the same lines that had produced bombers now produced tractors, automobiles, refrigerators. The hands that had hammered wings for war were now forging comfort, rebuilding a nation that had given everything. For the workers of Willow Run, for the riveters and machinists, there was pride, but also grief. They had built the tools of victory, but victory had taken too much. Across the Atlantic, the Allied soldiers who liberated the camps carried nightmares that no victory parade could erase. They had seen what happens when technology outruns morality, when laboratories become slaughterhouses, and engineers turn into executioners. Their photographs and testimonies became the evidence of civilization's deepest failure. At the Nuremberg trials, men who once called themselves scientists and officers stood in silence before the world. Their defense was always the same. We were following orders. But the world had changed. Following orders was no longer an excuse. Humanity demanded something higher: responsibility. Among the exhibits were drawings of gas chambers, fragments of rockets, and pages of calculations. The same precision that had built those weapons now stood as proof of guilt. In that courtroom, the line between genius and monstrosity became forever clear. And yet, even from the ashes of tyranny, the seeds of tomorrow took root. Captured foe. 2 rockets were studied by American and Soviet engineers. Operation Paperclip brought German scientists, including Werner von Braun, to the United States. It was a decision filled with moral contradiction. Men who had served a regime of horror were now building engines for exploration. But such is the irony of history. The same technology that once terrorized London would one day send astronauts beyond the clouds. The rockets that rained death became the vessels that carried humanity to the moon. Science, when guided by conscience, had found redemption. Meanwhile, in homes across America, veterans struggled to adjust to peace. Some took jobs in factories, some went back to school, and some never spoke again of what they had seen. The GI Bill opened doors to education and housing, planting the roots of a new middle class. A new generation grew up in a world that promised prosperity, but also carried the unspoken memory of sacrifice. Teachers began to tell the stories in classrooms. Preachers spoke of forgiveness in churches. And parents, who had once hidden the war from their children, began to whisper the truth, that freedom is not inherited, it is earned every single day. For many survivors of Europe, The war was not an end but a beginning. They rebuilt their cities, their faith, their families. In the ruins of the Reich, new voices called for unity, not revenge. And in 1945, a symbol of hope was born, the United Nations, a promise that nations could stand together for peace. But history is a restless teacher. The Cold War began almost as soon as the last shots of the old one ended. The world was divided again, this time not by trenches but by ideologies and nuclear codes. The lessons of the past seemed to fade, but they were never gone. They lived in veterans' eyes, in photographs, in memorial walls carved with names. Every monument, every wreath, every poppy pinned to a lapel was a whisper, never again. For those who had seen the cost of silence, peace was not a guarantee, it was a duty. They taught their children to question power, to defend truth, to stand for justice even when it is unpopular, because they knew that tyranny does not begin with bombs, it begins with lies, fear, and indifference. In the decades that followed, the echo of that war shaped everything. The civil rights movement, the space race, the dream of a better America. From the ashes of battlefields came universities, highways, and families who believed that the world could, at last, grow wiser. And yet, the shadow of World War II never fully faded. Every new conflict, every cry for freedom, still carries its reflection. Because the greatest lesson of that war is not about who won. It is about what humanity chose to become afterward. Freedom, they learned, is not a gift handed down by generals. It is a flame carried by ordinary people, kept alive by honesty, work, and love. In a quiet cemetery in Normandy, rows of white crosses face the sea. The wind moves through them softly, as if reading their names aloud. Each one tells the same story, that courage and conscience are the twin engines of peace. And somewhere in that silence, the world still hears the same question echoing through time. Will we remember? Will we choose to build, not destroy? Will we learn at last that the only lasting victory is the one that makes us more human? When the history of World War II is told, it often ends with surrender papers, parades, and photographs of smiling soldiers returning home. But the real ending, the one that matters, does not live in books. It lives in the quiet choices made afterward. To rebuild instead of hate, to remember instead of deny, to teach instead of forget. The war had ended, but its echo traveled farther than any bomb or bullet. It reshaped nations, redrew maps, and redefined what it meant to be human. For the first time in history, the world saw the power of unity and the price of division. In the cities once buried under rubble, children played again. They grew up beside monuments built from broken stones, in classrooms where teachers said, "This is what happens when freedom sleeps." And in those same places, the dream of peace began to breathe again. Artists painted what words could not express. Writers filled their pages with warning and hope. Scientists turned their eyes to the stars, not to conquer, but to understand. Every act of creation became an act of resistance against destruction. Every handshake between former enemies became proof that peace is stronger than pride. The soldiers of World War II had not fought merely to win a conflict. They had fought to remind the world of its own soul. Their sacrifice was not only a defense of nations, it was a defense of truth, of conscience, of the fragile belief that humanity can learn from its pain. And that lesson remains, because tyranny is patient. It waits for memory to fade. It whispers in the language of fear and calls itself order. That is why remembrance matters. Every museum, every candle lit on Memorial Day, every story told to a grandchild keeps the light alive. It is how we fight for peace, even when the guns are silent. The men and women who lived through World War II are leaving us now. Their voices are fading, but their message is not. They ask us for one simple promise: to guard what they gave, to question what they feared, to defend what they loved: freedom, justice, and human dignity. So, when we look at the sky they once fought beneath, we do not see the smoke of battle. We see the light of endurance, the proof that from even the darkest century humanity can rise again. And as long as we remember, as long as we fight not for conquest but for compassion, then the story of World War II will never be just a memory. It will remain a mirror, reminding us who we are and who we must never become.